All right, everyone. Hello, welcome to Professional Previews. So my name is R. I work at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and I will be your host for the first professional preview of 2022. So this is a new program where we invite you to get to know different science, technology, engineering, art, and math professionals and find out how they got where they are. So they'll introduce themselves, they'll say what they do, and they'll answer any questions that you have about their career path, school experiences, and other interests. So our guest today is someone that's probably going to be a familiar face to you if you decide to watch the future professional previews. We're going to get to know the host, Michael Lewis. But before we get started, there are some rules that we want you to abide by. So please keep your camera and microphone off during the program. This is recorded. It's just for your safety and comfort during this program. If you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat. So our moderator will be gathering all your questions, and at the end, we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. Please keep any comments or questions relevant to today's discussion, but we do want you to have fun and learn new things and interact with us. So just please use the chat, be curious, ask your questions, but please keep your microphone and camera off. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and let our special guest here, Michael Lewis, introduce himself, and we'll get started.
All right, so hello everyone. My name is Michael Lewis. I use he, him pronouns, and I'll be telling you all a little bit about my journey to get where I am now, as well as what I do here at the Museum of Natural Sciences. So without further ado, we can go to our slideshow. All right, so first, a little bit about me. I'm from Goldsboro, North Carolina, which is just an hour southeast of Raleigh. I have a Bachelor of Arts degree in Biological Sciences with a cross-discipline in Public Science Education and Outreach. I have a Master's of Education in Informal STEM Education. I got both of those degrees from NC State, and I've been at the Museum of Natural Sciences since 2017. I love to go on all sorts of adventures with my friends, and so on the left-hand side, you'll see a couple of images. There's one of me in a graduation cap. On the right-hand side, there's me drawn as a airbender from the TV show Avatar: The Last Airbender. And then the bottom two pictures are me and some friends on a hike. So a little bit more about me is I'm a first generation college student. So that means that I'm the first person in my family to go to college. I love all sorts of things like video games, anime, hiking, other science centers. So whenever I go to other cities, I love to go to museums, nature preserves, and whatnot. I am a photographer of sorts. You can follow my Instagram at I_of_Michelangelo. On the bottom right-hand side, those are some of the pictures that you'll see. And then another fun fact about me is that I've actually never left the East Coast of the US. So I do hope to change that next month. Hopefully I'll be going to Australia if COVID numbers stay sane and everything else works out. But on the top right, there's an image that kind of looks like a heat map. So that is actually Google's like location tracking with the images, the pictures that you take. And so you can see a lot of that is concentrated around North Carolina. There's a bit in Virginia, just from some of my hiking adventures. And then there's a large heat spot up in Washington, DC. And that's where I went for a few summers. Next, we'll look at my career path so far, just looking at what are some of the things that I did and how did I get into all of these things. So my career kind of started with me volunteering at the Fort Fisher Aquarium in high school. So I really enjoyed my time there and just kind of teaching people and about sea life. I really wanted to be a marine biologist when I was younger. As you can see, I'm not a marine biologist right now, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next, whenever I entered university, My second semester, my freshman year, I learned about this outreach opportunity called Shark Tooth Forensics, and this was with a paleontologist, Dr. Terry Gates. He also has worked here at the museum and is a professor at NC State. And this was a citizen science project that looked at prehistoric shark teeth. So we were sifting through sediment, taking measurements of the shark teeth, and this is the image that you see above that dot on the timeline there. And that's when I really discovered my passion for outreach and really wanting to teach people and be involved in the classroom, but in more of an informal setting than a traditional school teacher. Then that led me to co-found the Citizen Science Club. So R is also another one of the co-founders of the Citizen Science Club at NC State. And this was just a new opportunity to get people involved in citizen science. And if you aren't familiar with what that is, it's just everyday people doing science. So a lot of times when people think of science, they think that you have to be a person with a degree and working in a lab. And science doesn't always look like that. That is just one way that science looks. But with citizen science, anyone can be a scientist. This involves taking measurements, pictures, all sorts of things. Then next we have an internship in the Natural World Investigate Lab. So this was my first venture into the Museum of Natural Sciences. This happened my sophomore year of university, and I really liked the public engagement aspect of that. So that was in the Natural World Investigate Lab, there were stations set up and you could, people, so family groups, kids, parents, grandparents, anyone could just come into one of our interactive labs and take part in some of the science experiments that were set up there. And it was just really a very open environment. People had all sorts of questions, and I loved being able to answer those questions and kind of foster that spark for the curiosity that people had. After that, I transitioned into a weekend captain at the Naturalist Center, which was also here at the Museum of Natural Sciences. This was one of our hands-on interactive spaces. It had all sorts of taxidermied animals and specimens in jars. There's like the bear pelts, there's a dried horseshoe crab, all sorts of things that were an interactive collections. So this gave people from the everyday public an opportunity to touch things and see a small glimpse into what a museum's collections might actually be like. While I was doing that, I started on a research project while I was still in school. So all this was happening while I was still at university at NC State. I started on an interactive video game project called Missions with Monty. So this video game was a science-based video games, and it was meant to teach fifth graders just reading comprehension and metacognition skills. And so that's thinking about what you know and what you don't know. So, you know, we involved like asking people about science topics, and then asking them how sure they were about these their answers to these topics. And so that is what metacognition is knowing what you know. And then after that, I graduated undergrad, and while I was in grad school, I started as an AmeriCorps member, also here at the Museum of Natural Sciences. So really just kind of climbing my way up that ladder. And I was a youth engagement specialist for the Teen Science Cafes. That is also a national network. So even if you haven't heard of the Teen Science Cafes through our museum, you might have seen this with some other science institution. And I had a really, really fun time coordinating that and getting other science professionals, but this was a little bit more formal than professional previews. So we had high schoolers leading, emceeing events and really engaging with these science professionals. And so all of this kind of builds up into what I do today. So I am currently the education coordinator for Race, Are We So Different? And this was an exhibit that originally premiered in 2005. And it was created by the American Anthropological Association, as well as the Science Museum of Minnesota. So this exhibit looks to explore what race is, how race has impacted our society, and how we can move towards undoing racism. Obviously, racism is kind of one of the things that is baked into the foundings of America. But with this, we hope to explore some of those topics and just kind of ease people into some of these hard to understand and honestly quite difficult topics. Race and talking about race and racism makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And that's one of the things that we hope to overcome with this exhibit is break down that first barrier to open further conversations about race and about racism. So yeah, that's it for my presentation. If anyone has any questions about that, feel free to drop those in the chat. Otherwise,
Yeah, I definitely have some questions for you. So I'm going to start with my questions. But again, if you have any questions in the chat, well, if you have any questions, type them in the chat, any comments, and we'll get to them as many as we can with the time that we have. So I'm in the unique situation where I do actually know you pretty well outside of work. One question that I had, you're doing all of this during university. How did you manage that? Like, university is a full-time job within itself. Like, it's very intensive.
Yeah.
But then you're also doing all of these other things outside of that. How did you manage to do all of these things at once?
Well, I guess if I have to be completely honest, at sometimes I didn't. And that's one of those tough things of because I was a first generation college student, I felt a lot of pressure from my family, as well as pressures from society of like what it's like to go to college and what it's like to be the perfect college student. Disclaimer, that doesn't exist. So really trying to figure out that school life balance is kind of like a work-life balance, because as you said, going to the university is a full-time job. It was something that took me my entire journey of undergrad. It wasn't until my second semester senior year that I was finally able to kind of work out like that healthy relationship. And that did actually involve going to therapy. And so that was one of those things of understanding my own mental health struggles and how that impacted my schooling, as well as all of these other things that I was involved in. Because if you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of all of these other things.
Right.
So yeah.
So kind of to expand on that, what did your family think of you doing all of these things, or do they have some kind of understanding of both your academic background and what you do now, or your previous jobs? Like what do other people, especially your family, talking about being a first generation college student and that kind of pressure to be this perfect, have straight A's, have all these things?
Right.
How does do you share this information with your family? What do they think about it?
Yeah. So
and if it's too personal, feel free to not
no,
to not answer it.
No, it's okay. Yeah, talking about this with my family was kind of difficult simply because I am a first generation college student. There wasn't a lot of things that they could really relate to. And then, my parents' notion of what going to college is completely different than what college is like today. And so, kind of having some of those barriers there where it kind of exacerbated the issue, because I did feel like I was alone at some point. So just not being able to talk about the struggles that I was going through, or even, talk about some of the successes of being involved in research in a NSF grant funded project, to my parents didn't really mean as much as it does to someone who knows how hard it is to get an NSF grant, a National Science Foundation grant, and that it's a federal grant, and there are so many moving pieces, and that it's a lot of money. So it was finding a community at State, was one of those ways that I was able to talk about some of those struggles and also some of those successes, and have people truly understand what I was going through. So yeah, it can be difficult, but also just trying to be open with your family and provide that communication, knowing that if I were to ever have kids and they decide to go to college, like I can understand, I can relate to some of those things.
So following that of finding a community on campus to support you, did you have any either research mentors or just mentors in your academic sphere to kind of guide you to fulfill
Yes.
that kind of parental professional role almost?
Yes, so shout out to Dr. Jamila Simpson. She is the Associate Dean of the College of Sciences, Academic Affairs, or Assistant Dean. I always forget the title. But she was like one of my main reasons why I was able to graduate. She provided that safe space in that community as well. Just being a person of color, she was the first Black woman to graduate with a meteorology degree from NC State. And that was in the year 2000. So, and that was kind of one of those things that was shocking to hear of like, wow, NC State has been around for what, 200 plus years or
Yeah,
so of
yeah.
like, and the first Black woman to graduate with a meteorology degree was in 2000. So yeah, it was nice again to have that person who understands what it's like. We actually had a lot of similar paths, Dr. Simpson and I. She worked here at this very museum, has worked under some of the same people. And then her research was looking at Black families and informal learning institutions. So how, like, what are their perceptions of it? What are things that can make them feel more invited? Like, what can institutions do to make this a space that is inviting for your people who don't necessarily match the stereotype of a scientist?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, as someone who, again, I have the very unique experience of being very good friends with our special guest. So I can also speak to that concept of building a community on campus to support you when you don't necessarily have external communities to support you in that way. And then we had a question about your video game research. So your
Yeah.
Missions with Monty project.
Mhm.
Can you explain a little bit more about that? And then did that experience change your understanding of video games? I know you're an avid video game
Yes.
player,
Yes.
which kind of contributed to why you were a part of this
Mhm.
this project. So can you go into that a little bit more and if that shaped your experiences as a consumer of video games?
Yeah, so I first got involved in this project simply because of I took a class. I went up to the professor after class and was asking him some questions about this other research, the shark tooth forensics project that I was on, and looking at informal science and different ways to engage people in science. And he was like, "Hey, you should check out this video game that we're on called Missions with Monty." And that was Dr. John Neatfield, if you all wanted to look him up. But this video game, so I didn't have the educational psychology experience, so that he was an educational psychologist, and that's what he and his research team were looking at it through. But I had the science background, and I was an avid video game player. So I kind of served as like their fact checker for some of the science content, just making sure that things were correct, as well as talking about video game mechanics, because no one else on the team really played video games like I did. It's like, oh, back in the day, we played the Atari and like SNES, and it's like, wow, things are a lot different than back
Yes.
then. So just me bringing that authentic self of like, I really loved video games, but even though I didn't have that educational psychology background, I still had these assets that were very valuable to the team. I'll be it's like so the that experience was really fun because seeing video games through a new lens was really engaging, just because I had a new understanding and a new appreciation for all of the things that went into this. Even though this was a very simple kind of like point and click type of video game that we were designing, that that game really opened my eye into like the development process and how much work goes into something that is so simple like this. Um, yeah, like that, it really changed my whole outlook on video games.
So more questions. Again, I apologize to viewers. I have lots of questions, but again, if you have any, please type them in the chat. We will definitely have time to answer them. But Missions with Monty was a research project. And would you be interested in doing more research along those lines? Or if you had the opportunity to do research, what fields would you want to explore? Like what concepts, given that your background is very diverse through all different things?
Yeah.
What research would you want to do if you had that opportunity?
So I don't necessarily think that I would go down that same route of educational video games, excuse me, as a research track, but rather kind of looking at other ways that people interact with video games. So observing people, like how people just kind of behave and interact. You know, if you in a sense, like a lot of video games are free choice learning environments, which is what science museums and aquariums and other institutions like that are. It's a free choice learning environment. So you're able to just kind of go and do things, do whatever you wish, but you know, there is that main objective. In a place like a science museum, it's to learn. In a place like a video game, you know, it's to complete that quest. So just kind of looking and seeing how people interact and just kind of go about their everyday lives, especially in a open world like role-playing game or something where there isn't necessarily that set path, because it's like life. There isn't a set path to go down. You know, you can meander and try out all sorts of things and just kind of get distracted, but also find out you really like doing this other thing. You know, it's not necessarily the main quest, but it's really engaging for you, and that interest, the other people's interest is my interest. So just kind of understanding what people are interested in and what makes that appealing to them. If I were to ever do some type of research, that would probably be like understanding people's interests. Yeah.
So that kind of leads into my follow-up question that if you weren't in the current position that you have now, or along this specific quest in this endless video game called life, what would you be doing, or what would be another career interest that you would have pursued if you hadn't gone down this one branch of life? What were some of the other branches you maybe considered or consider right now to maybe potentially explore someday?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, you know, at the very beginning, I wanted to be a marine biologist. I honestly feel like any kid that was born in the 90s wanted to be a marine biologist at some point. You know, it was something that's fascinating and still fascinating to this day, of like the ocean is just amazing. And seeing how life just is so different than what we're used to on land. That has always been fascinating to me, like how this ecosystem has just evolved over time is fantastic. So I would definitely love to go down that route. And then just, again, one of those other branches off my career path timeline that I showed earlier, really, I love engaging with the public and just being that person that's like boots on the ground. Again, I liked interacting with students in a classroom, but not necessarily in that strict teacher sense of like, I love doing outreach. I love engaging with the public and people who maybe don't find that traditional schooling is right for them. Because this is, you know, you're still learning, it's just in a different sense. And there isn't necessarily a test that's going to define your grade at the end of the semester, you know, and I feel like that pressure really, really gives people an opportunity to learn better than it would if they knew that they were going to be tested on it, or their grade depended on it or something like that.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
lets people kind of learn at their own speed and
Yeah.
to explore their own interests,
Yeah.
really. So let's see. We have a question from the chat. What's been your favorite hiking adventure so far?
Oh, wow. I will say that I go on hiking adventures probably like twice a year with my friends. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, so it was spring break of 2020. So looking at like March 13th or so, we were actually up in Virginia in the mountains, just having fun. We were kind of away for cell service. And so, again, talking about this whole work-life balance, school life balance thing, I was just really overwhelmed. And I was like, I'm going to take this moment to just disconnect. So I turned off all my school emails, my notifications, work notifications. I was just like, I'm just going to enjoy being out in nature, being with my friends and stuff. And little did we know, the world kind of fell apart while we
Right.
were gone. There was no toilet paper, all of that stuff. But I do think that that one is definitely pretty high up there as far as one of my favorite hiking adventures. Just we went to places like Hanging Rock and Pilot Mountain, and I think that's probably one of my favorites. And then it was immediately tainted by the following 2 years
Right.
of pandemic and whatnot. But yeah, so spring 2020 definitely like top of the list.
You had that true zombie movie experience of you woke
Yes.
up and got into cell service coming out of the mountains
Yeah.
and the world had changed forever.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So let's see. What are some other fun questions I can ask you? Again, if you have any questions in the chat, we'll be reading them later. Let's see. So marine biology. Do you
Mhm.
have a favorite animal?
Yeah, so all-time favorite animal is octopus. Octopuses are just so cool. Like they're probably the closest thing to aliens that we have that are on Earth. I mean, they have 9 brains because each tentacle can be considered a brain because it's each tentacle functions independently. Their hearts are really weird. They have blue blood. They can squeeze through any hole that is smaller, as large as their beak. That's also another thing. Octopuses have beaks, in case you didn't know. They can change the texture and color of their skin, and also their intelligence is just unmatched, honestly. So yeah, that's definitely my favorite animal is octopus.
And
Yeah.
then a follow-up to that. I mean, again, I have tons of questions. Do you have a favorite part of this museum here in Raleigh? I know you mentioned talking about working in the Naturalist Center, being an intern in the Natural World Investigate Lab, doing carts and other programs, doing Teen Science Cafe, things like that. But do you have a favorite part or experience at the museum? Something that you, if someone told you, like, you can only have this one thing from the museum, what would it be?
Yeah, I would definitely have to say the Naturalist Center, just because of how unique of a exhibit that is for any museum space. Um, you know, most museums don't allow you to touch things. They're normally barred off behind some type of rope or some plexiglass, and it's like this. You're just that close to experiencing it, but it's like I just want to reach out and touch it. But with the Naturalist Center, people did get that opportunity, to feel a bear pelt, because I hope that you're not going out and petting bears, in your everyday life, but like a bear pelt, or just kind of understanding, how heavy a meteorite is compared to pumice. So, just being able to feel those things and just truly interact with science in a way that is normally not accessible to the public. So I do think that if someone said that everything else had to go, like
You would
just
keep the
that
Naturalist Center.
experience, that
Gotcha.
experience, I think, is one of the most valuable experiences that we have here.
Interesting. So sort of tangential to that, of talking about that in-person hands-on experience. What role do you think virtual programs like professional previews have in a museum or in an institution anywhere? Like, what do you think professional previews can offer people if you're so, not to say you're against the virtual experiences,
Right.
but if you've had this experience with the in-person aspect,
Mhm.
do you think things like professional previews, like what role do you think they have in museums or other informal science education centers?
Yeah, so as we've seen over the past 2 years, virtual programming is just the way to go. It really expands your audience reach, and I saw that particularly with the teen science cafes. So before we did have them in person in our Daily Planet cafe that was here at the museum, but then we shifted to a completely virtual format. And so this gave the opportunity for us to connect with speakers who aren't local to Raleigh, to the Raleigh area. So that way, we could reach out to someone who is in the mountains, at the coast, or not even in North Carolina at all. But again, with the powers of the internet, we are able to make those connections, as well as broadcast to a wider audience.
Mhm.
Um, because people who can't always make it to the museum, or certain museums have fees associated with their admissions or whatnot. So, professional previews is a completely free program, and it just offers that insight that you might not be able to get just by visiting an institution, of being able to talk directly with this person, using like the chat feature, and you know, uh, just being able to connect to the people as people rather than as a scientist or as
Mhm.
a person in a lab or something like that. Um, so I do think that these types of virtual programs is just a way to reach a different audience, really.
As someone who's been in favor of virtual programs, they are more accessible as well. That's a
Mhm.
feature that I really like about virtual programs. And you do get this chance to ask these behind the scenes questions and things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
You really get to know these different professionals as people, like you're
yeah,
saying.
yeah.
So another question from the chat is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Oof.
And then I will
Yeah.
expand on that question a little bit more of what advice would you give to your younger self as the young kid starting off at the aquarium thinking he's going to be a marine biologist, and then also to yourself like maybe freshman or sophomore year of college, like to
Mhm.
those as we grow and change we become very different people. So what advice would you give to your much younger self, the
Right.
one that wanted to be a marine biologist was still volunteering and sort of figuring things out, and then
Mhm.
also to your younger self that was entering university and sort of figuring out your place within academia as well as going into becoming a young adult?
So I'm gonna answer the question without answering the question.
My favorite.
I know. So words of advice, I feel like I just try to live by every day now. It's just be the person you needed when you were younger.
Mm,
So again, when I was younger, I didn't really see too many people like myself, being a black man in any type of education is very rare to come by, especially in an informal science center, like a museum or aquarium. So being that person I needed when I was younger in terms of simply just existing in this type of space of like,
mhm,
oh, it feels like I can do that just a little bit more of like, oh, there's this person who like, we have these shared experiences or something, or, it's just kind of a sigh of relief of like, wow, this person might have some of those come from the same background as me. And so they know just a little bit more, they understand just a little bit more like of those things that I really value or enjoy.
mhm.
um, so be the person you needed when you were younger. So that's my word of advice. And again, doesn't exactly answer the question, but it answered the question.
Well, it's advice that could apply to your younger self
Yes.
as well as to anyone else.
Yeah.
And so kind of going off of that and your role as the education coordinator for race,
Mhm.
um, and I sort of already know the answer to this, but how important do you think it is for representation of diversity in informal science institutions and centers How important do you think that is? And what are some ways that you think that um, institutions could improve that?
So how important is it? Very.
I,
Enough said.
I, I,
Just like,
I could have
yeah.
figured that answer.
Yeah, it's incredibly important simply because we know that representation matters. There have been numerous studies that show representation matters. And one interesting experiment that has been conducted since around the 60s is the Draw a Scientist test. And this is a very simple test that you can give to anyone of any age, but it's particularly done with late elementary school to like early high school students. And you ask them to draw a scientist. And so what we saw is very early on, everyone drew white men, you know, lab coat, glasses, crazy hair in a chemistry lab, because media shapes our perception of what a scientist is. But if you look at how that study has been repeated, you know, into like 2020 and stuff like that, people are starting to draw themselves more often. And so, you know, that's a very interesting shift in the dynamic of, oh, there's this person who doesn't look like me at all and is only doing this one type of science, to, you know, someone who is out in the field on safari. I remember when I took this as a freshman in college, like I didn't know the background behind it. I ended up drawing myself in safari, like in, you know, I guess the plains of Africa in cargo shorts and the binoculars and everything. I ended up drawing myself as the scientist. And so, you know, it's showing people who look like them is incredibly important, because it breaks down an extra barrier of like, I can't do this because no one else who is like me is doing this. And then I forget the second half of your question.
What are
Sorry.
some ways? So like we've proven diversity matters,
Yes.
representation matters.
Yes.
What are some ways that informal science education centers could improve on that? Like what are some not necessarily like rules or guidelines, but just
Right.
again,
For
even
like-
even though you're against advice, general
Yeah.
advice, what advice would you give to help improve diversity at places like museums or aquariums?
Yeah, I'd say simply just reaching out to audiences that we don't typically reach. Because, you know, a lot of times these institutions are either located in a place, or, you know, they just have a certain audience that always goes there. And so, you know, particularly with outreach and virtual ed programs, you can reach a totally different audience. And, you know, one of the ways that our museum is shifting now is including bilingual text for our exhibits. And if you saw briefly, whenever I had the little poster for race, it's actually bilingual, because the race exhibit that I'm working on is going to be completely bilingual in English and Spanish. So just making those people feel welcome is just one of those ways that we could really increase a diverse audience. And again, representation. So if you make sure that your educators and your staff reflect the audiences that you're trying to serve, that's one of those ways to just naturally increase diversity.
Gotcha. So thinking of your very extensive career path, what challenges have you faced being a Black man in science education and outreach? Like what challenges have you faced? Because I feel like that's always a understated aspect of careers, of that those difficulties that you can face being an other, being different.
Right. It's definitely, there were times of isolation and imposter syndrome where I felt like I've gotten this far, but I shouldn't be here again. And that comes from not seeing role models that kind of look like me or who I can relate to directly. So that has definitely been one of the personal challenges here. And even with the exhibit that I'm working on, it's something that we've seen a lot of news and politics of, like critical race theory and stuff like that, of just teaching people about the history of the not so pretty history of the US, and especially the US's relations when it comes to race, is something, again, it makes people uncomfortable, and some people just want to shut that out completely. But that's definitely not the way to go about it. Um, and so, yeah, it's one of those things of it can feel like the world is against me sometimes, but again, finding that community and realizing that there are those people who are on your team who are always advocating for you and what you do, that's important.
Gotcha. Yeah. So we're approaching the end of this program, at least the recorded camera on part of this program. But we're going to end this with one final, and I honestly think one of my favorite questions thus far is if you could spend the night in any museum, where are you going? And I would also add, why are you going there?
So this, I feel like I can't answer this as effectively as I would like to because my experiences with museums is very limited. Again, I haven't left the East Coast, but the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History is probably it, just because first of all, my museum is just
Right,
great
right.
movie. And the couple of times that I've been there, when I went to DC, I was like, wow, there's just so much to see. And if I'm there at nighttime, there's not going to be anyone else there. So I can just take it all in, just like
Mhm.
slowly read everything, peruse through, and just take some good photos, and then get really creeped out because I'm gonna be like, what sound was that? Is the mammoth or the elephant coming alive in here? Yeah. So again, just based off my limited experience, the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Mike,
Yeah.
for sharing your experiences being the first guest of the 2022 Professional Preview Series. And we thank you all for joining us as well. We are going to stop recording our program soon and allow people to turn on your cameras. If you don't feel comfortable turning on your camera or you have someplace else to be, or you feel like you've gotten enough out of this program, you're welcome to leave. We thank you again for joining us. Thank you for asking questions and participating in this. Stay tuned for future professional previews, as we will most likely have some really awesome guests coming up in the future. But for the people that are deciding to stay, you're more than welcome to turn on your camera, continue using the chat, and we'll keep this going just a little bit longer. But again, if you need to leave for any reason, that is totally okay. Thank you for coming. We appreciate your participation.